Welcome everyone to the webinar on controlling blossom end rot and other blemishes in dry farm tomatoes. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic, and this presentation will last approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have 30 more minutes for audience questions. So I realized before this webinar that it's been over 10 years since our last webinar about dry farming, and there's definitely been a lot more interest in this technique, especially in our region of Western Oregon. So today I'm very pleased to welcome Matthew Davis, who is a fourth generation Oregon dry farmer and a faculty research assistant at Oregon State University. He has been researching and publishing about dry farming here since 2019. So Matt, I'm going to let you take it from here, and I'm just going to turn off my video and hand over the screen control to you.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Alice. This is great. Yeah, so I'm here today. I got invited to present on this project that we've been working on since 2023 about controlling blossom end rot and other blemishes in dry farm tomatoes. And through this presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of a introduction to what dry farming is and some of the methods that we use to, ensure that we get a crop. And then after that, we'll kind of dive into the tools of the toolkit. My idea was to create a suite of tools that farmers can use to reduce drought stress and increase yields and reduce these blemishes for dry farm tomatoes. And we'll talk about the ones that worked and the ones that we found didn't work, and then some of the drawbacks of even using these tools to reduce drought stress and how that affects other parts of the crop, like flavor intensity. So I thought I'd start with a definition of what a dry farm tomato is. And as we go through this, we'll find that there isn't necessarily agreement. And the first definition, and the one that I personally, subscribe to, is that a dry farm tomato is never irrigated. So we grow these crops in Mediterranean climates like the Pacific Northwest or coastal California, where it's cool and wet during the winter and warm and dry during the summer. And during that summer growing period, we grow these crops without any irrigation, with very little rainfall, and they're using the residual soil moisture from the rainy season to grow on. And there's actually a lot of moisture that's held in the soil that they can use. And that's not like the water table, it's just, this moisture that clings to the particles and of the soil. And this has been practiced for a really long time. And there are, traditional practices of this in Sicily and in Spain and in the Middle East. So this is not a new thing. This isn't something that we at OSU discovered. I think of myself as being someone who is researching and documenting this kind of like older style of agriculture that is reemerging in popularity here in the Pacific Northwest. However, there are some dry farmers that do irrigate. They'll irrigate once at the start of the growing season, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you don't have to, and that's something that I like to encourage people, to take the training wheels off and to really go for it and not use any irrigation. And it's amazing how resilient these crops are. In California, the growers down there, they really believe that a dry farm tomato needs to be small, needs to be thick-skinned, and it needs to be intensely flavored. So you can see in this picture here on the right, we have some early girl tomatoes, and you can see that they're pretty variable in size, but looking at them, you can tell that they're really intensely flavored and tasty. And for these California growers, that quality is actually more important than irrigation. And so a lot of the California growers, they do use irrigation, early season irrigation. And, what's important for them is that they get that intense flavor. And you can actually, not irrigate at all. And on some sites, you'll still get kind of the more normal irrigated tomato flavor, and you won't achieve that intense flavor that they want. For dry farm tomato, under ideal conditions, you're going to get about 20 to 30 tons per acre of total productivity. This is for early girl tomato. Not all these fruit are going to be marketable though. Some of them are going to have blemishes, and you actually get quite a bit of blemishes with dry farming. If you compare this 20 to 30 tons per acre to the processed tomato industry in California, they're getting like 50 tons an acre. And, with high tunnel tomatoes or greenhouse tomatoes, you can get even more yield. So, this is a lower yielding crop. And especially when you take into account the blemishes that can really cut into the yields. I've worked with farms where we've had little to no blemishes, and I've had farms where, all the fruit or almost all the fruit are affected. And that's, a big difference and the difference between success and a crop failure, or between 20 tons per acre and, 3 tons per acre. So this paper on the dry farmers in California gets a little bit more into these perspectives on what a dry farm tomato is. I like these quotes. I like to show them to people. So we have two different growers here. We have Farmer I, and he says, "I'm in the camp of legit. I only advertise my products as dry farmed if they're truly dry farmed. And if they're not, I would say minimally irrigated or something like that." So this is someone who says it's dry farmed if you don't irrigate. And if you irrigate, then it's no longer dry farmed. But then you have Farmer G here who says, if you're telling me you're dry farming it and it tastes like water, then you're not dry farming. And so this is that, is it the practices or is it the quality of the fruit that matters more? And in California, there isn't agreement on this. And I think that what I see here in Oregon too is that if you don't get that really intense flavor, if you don't get these sort of qualities that the growers talk about, then growers don't necessarily want to even market it as dry farm because, they want to protect that brand and, they want to reserve that sort of name and recognition for their highest quality tomatoes. So why would you want to dry farm tomatoes? I think it's important to start with why you wouldn't want to dry farm tomatoes, and there's a number of reasons why, dry farming is maybe not appropriate for everyone. A big reason why you might not want to dry farm, at least here in the Willamette Valley, is that high tunnel tomatoes are earlier. We work with growers who do high tunnel tomatoes. They're getting their first ripe fruit in June. With dry farming, you have to grow them out of tunnels because you need that rain to fill up the soil profile and give you your crop. And so because you're growing in the field, you're not going to start getting tomatoes until the beginning of August, or the end of July. And so that's one reason why you might not want to dry farm tomatoes. It's just because they're later. The yields are lower. We've already talked about this. You have an increase in blemishes, and we'll go through these blemishes, but blossom end rot, yellow shoulder, sun scalding, all these are related to stress, and they increase for dry farming. So if you dry farm, you're going to get more blemishes. And then the final thing is that they're actually more expensive to produce per ton. And the reason for this is because you have lower yields. And so, you're putting in all these costs, you're paying for your plants, you're spending the time to plant, and you have all your fixed costs, and all these things add up. And because your yields are lower, that each pound of tomato you produce actually costs more than if you were to irrigate. However, you do spend less time weeding, you spend less time harvesting because your yields are lower. That's one thing that I love about dry farming. I have my own little plot that I'm trying to do commercially, and I find that, like I've spent maybe an hour or two weeding it, and it's just so easy to keep clean because you're not irrigating, you're not germing up weeds. Um, some reasons why you might want to dry farm tomatoes. A big reason is that increased marketability, especially during the peak of the season. So we have a farmer here from that paper earlier talking about why they like to dry farm tomatoes. And they say at the bottom, and it's worth having less to have the best because you're getting new customers and you're trying to grow your base. So this is the idea that, like, you can get more customers in, they'll come to you, get the dry farm tomatoes, and maybe they buy other things. And these things are highly marketable. I've talked to growers in Washington State, and they talk about how they always sell out of dry farm tomatoes and they can sell them for more. And the price premium for one of them was about $1 a pound. So, that's a big deal. And that more than makes up for the cost of producing them, that fact that they're more expensive, as long as your yields are high enough. If you have a crop failure, then maybe not. Another reason to dry farm is that it's a great method for organic weed control because you're not irrigating, you're not germinating weed seeds, throughout the growing season. So it's really easy to keep the farm clean. And then farmers actually use this in rotation. So they can dry farm a crop, tomato crop in one year, and they know that if they plant something and irrigate it next year, the weed pressure isn't going to be as high. And then the third reason is that, you can conserve water, and there's environmental concerns. I know that for squash, there was an analysis done, and they found that they were saving about 300,000 gallons per acre by not irrigating their crop. So we're going to go into some of the steps of how to grow dry farm tomato. Some of these are going to be covered more in depth when we talk about the different tools in the toolkit, but a couple of them we need to go over first. So this is one of my research trials at OSU. This was from 2024, I think. So some of the important things that you need to consider when you're dry farming to grow these tomatoes successfully, you need to think about site selection, making sure that you have a good soil and good climate to produce these crops. The success of a farm is highly dependent on the site characteristics like the soil texture, soil depth, and we'll get into that more. But that's one of our tools. I put a little star next to it to indicate that it's a tool that we're going to be covering. Soil prep is an important part of growing dry farm tomatoes, being sure to get out and to terminate your cover crop at the right time to get the soil, nice and fluffy and loose so you can plant and conserve that soil moisture and keep other pests or weeds off. You can see here this field is very clean. There are no weeds. That's super important for dry farming. We'll get into some of the specifics about planting. And then floor management is another important part of dry farming and another critical part of our toolkit. So looking a bit about soil prep, we recommend that farmers use cover crops to improve soil health. Cover cropping, it improves infiltration of moisture into the soil during the winter. It can help to prevent surface compaction and to create the macropores that the roots are going to, go through. Some resources say to use fall applied compost and amendments, and definitely you want to fall apply lime, but other amendments and compost, I found that they work just as well in the spring. So we do fertilizer trials, we do compost trials, and we apply these things during the spring, and they work, really well then too. They have an effect on the crop, and we'll get into that more in a little bit. One thing we tell growers to do is to prep early, but not too early. You obviously want to get in when there's a good break in the weather to terminate that cover crop. But if you terminate it too early, you can compact the soil, you can damage the soil by running your equipment when the soil is too wet. But if you let it sit for too long, if you let that cover crop get really big, it's going to start taking moisture from the soil. And that moisture in the soil is like your piggy bank, that you're going to be using to grow your crop. So you really want to make sure that you don't let that cover crop get too big and go on too long. And that's something that I've run into where, I have a miscommunication with the farm manager here about a trial, and he's got 100 things that he's trying to do. And I, it doesn't get to me until later, and it's been hot and dry. And I know that like that moisture is just getting taken away. And there's nothing I can do about it because he's using the big tractor and he doesn't have time to deal with my stuff. And those are those events where it's like, yeah, I've messed up. I've messed up my field prep. I'm gonna pre-irrigate. I'm gonna go out with a big gun or with a hand line. I'm gonna irrigate an inch and a half to try to rehydrate the soil. And I don't like doing that. I always feel like it's cheating, that I'm a bad dry farmer. But sometimes, you have to use irrigation to fix a problem, like you didn't prep your soil in time. As far as what kind of equipment you should use and what the strategy is, I recommend that farmers, when they're terminating their cover crop, when they're prepping the field, that tillage should be shallow. You don't want to go too deep because the deeper you go, the more you're going to aerate the soil, you're going to lose moisture. And obviously you want to go deep enough that you're going to break up any surface compaction that might be there. This equipment that you see here is the chisel plow. And so I like to go down to about 9 inches with the chisel plow and just break up any surface compaction, let the soil aerate a little bit before I go in with something like this, a power harrow. And this I do at about 4 to 5 inches depth, just to, create that nice fluffy bed that we're going to plant into. And with the power harrow, what's great about it is that it has these vertical teeth that, stick into the ground and twist, and that breaks up the soil, but without compacting it like you would get with a rototiller. So this is a really great piece of equipment if you have the money to invest in it. We use it all the time here at the Vegetable Research Farm. So after you have your field prepped, you're going to want to plant. And as far as like when to plant, I recommend here in the Willamette Valley, sometime between early May and early June when the soil temps are right at about, greater than 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And, let's say you prep in March or April, and because you got a good window and you get in and you terminate the cover crop just like I told you to do, you can let it sit, and you're going to lose very little moisture to evaporation. So you don't have to till and prep and then plant right away. You have a good window there, but I would recommend, then if your field has been sitting for a month or so, maybe weeds start to germinate back up again, you can go through and just clean it up and then plant into that. And one thing you'll find is that the soil surface is dry. You go out there, here we are planting. It's a very nice cloudy day. This is a great day to plant a dry farm trial, where, the plants aren't going to get very stressed. But I go through with this furrower and I do a lot of things manually. But this is a Valley Oak wheel hoe with the furrower attachment, and I'll put in a furrow just down to the moist soil. So I don't want to go too deep. I just want to get nice, shallow furrow to that moist soil, kind of knock that dry soil out of the way. And then I'll plant into that. And, sometimes I'll read online, people say, oh, you got to put in like a 2 foot deep trench and you got to plant these huge plants. And that's not true. And I feel like I'm trying to do this as quick as possible and to not, waste a lot of time with planting. And so this method has worked really well for me. And yeah, I use this planting tube. You can kind of see it in the back there, this little red, it's called a potapuki, but you can plant by hand. You could use a tractor transplanter. Like I'm sure that, it would work just as well to have, a furrower on the back of a tractor and then planting with the tractor transplanter. But one thing you want to do is make sure that the soil media is moist. So like every time before I plant, I soak the trays in sub-irrigation trays. Like I'll take the whole plant tray, dip it in, soak it up, because I want that root ball to be as moist as possible. And usually my arms are dripping when I'm planting these because I have, waters coming dripping off the bottom of these trays. And the way that I plant is generally 7 to 10 feet between rows, 18 to 24 inches between plants. This works great for me. So that's my recommended planting density. And then within a couple of days, I pulled this plant up. It was hot. It was dry in 2023. I dug this plant up a couple days after planting, and you can see the native roots are already moving. I mean, the roots are moving into that native soil. So it's incredibly quick how these plants they start to grow into the native soil, and that's why I don't bother to water in, because I know that there's moisture there in the soil and that the plant knows to like start rooting out and to access that, and it happens really fast. Now we're going to go through some of the blemishes of tomato, some of the ones that you'll see when you're dry farming, and the big one that we see a lot of is blossom end rot. So blossom end rot is related to drought stress, and it causes these big black spots on the bottom of the fruit that make the fruit unmarketable. But sometimes it's really light speckling. So this is also blossom end rot. When I do my data collection, I always call this blossom end rot light. There's a farmer in California who's trying to rebrand this as blossom end speckles or sparkles. And he says it's the sign of a good tomato, that that this tomato is stressed and it has that intense flavor. And yeah, farmers sell tomatoes like this. I've seen them wholesaled before. But if they're like this necrotic big black spot, then yeah, you cannot sell these. Yellow shoulder is another blemish of tomato. This is where there's like a ripening disorder. The top of the fruit doesn't ripen completely. I showed these ones to a farmer. He said that he could have sold these, but obviously this is, very obvious, and you might have a harder time selling this if it's to this degree of severity. Internal whitening is related to yellow shoulders. It's another ripening disorder, except it's inside the fruit, and so you don't see it until you cut it open. And then there's sun scalding. Sun scalding is caused by direct sun on the fruit in combination with really high temperatures. And so, yeah, this photo was before the fruit were ripe, and then after. Uh, and then splitting and cracking is another blemish that we'll see. So you can see this radial crack right here, the splitting on these fruit. And all these disorders are worse with dry farming. So for various reasons, but mostly because the plants are more stressed. And that stress means that things start to go wrong physiologically for the crop. But none of these blemishes are the result of disease. These are all the result of just the plant being drought stressed. So now we're going to get into the tools that we've developed for dry farmers. All of these tools I'm about to talk about can help you control these blemishes and can improve your marketable yields. And the first one to talk about, and probably the most powerful, I guess, or most effective thing to do would be to use grafting. And so the way that grafting works is basically we have these rootstocks that we've bred, and they're interspecific hybrids between the tomato that we like to eat, Solanum lycopersicum, and then there are all these like other tomato species that it'll cross with. And a lot of them are really drought resilient. They're from like the deserts of South America. And so you make these interspecific hybrids, and then the tomatoes on the rootstocks, you don't want to eat them, but you can graft the cultivated tomato that you like to eat on top. And look at all the things that it does. So grafting reduces drought stress. It can increase your yields, an average of 11 to 16 tons per acre. It reduces blossom end rot, average of 70% reduction in blossom end rot. Some of the commercially available rootstocks that we recommend include Fortamino, which is from High Mowing, DR141TX, Imperador, Maxifort. These all are rootstocks that can improve those yields and reduce blossom and rot. But the other thing that grafting does is because the plant isn't as stressed, it results in larger fruit and lower flavor intensity. And I think because of this, a lot of dry farmers are kind of skeptical of grafting. They don't like if their fruit doesn't taste intensely flavored, that's as much of a crop failure as if they have a bunch of blossom and rot. And, I'm interested maybe in going to some of the sites where it's really bad. I have certain sites where there's 90% blossom and rot. And if you're that kind of farmer, you're looking for anything to improve your yields. And so maybe with grafting, you'll get a little lower sweetness, a little lower flavor intensity, but you'll be able to produce, a bigger, better crop. If you're interested in doing grafting, and it's super easy, I do it in my office at work. Like we created a website called The Principles of Tomato Grafting. It's an OSU website. There's also the grafting manual at vegetablegrafting.org. This is something that any of you could do and figure out and do at home, do in your garden, do on your farm. It just takes some learning. And we'll go through some of the steps right now. So this picture is, I think it's from the grafting manual, but it shows how, in this first picture, we're cutting off the rootstock top. We're being sure to cut below the cotyledons, because if we leave the cotyledons on, then, there will be new shoots that sprout from the meristems at the leaf base. And then you slip this grafting clip on, you slide your scion in, and you can see how it's a perfect match. So they're both at this 45-degree angle. And then basically you heal the crop, takes about a week in like humid, warm, dark conditions. But eventually the vascular system of the plant fuses together, and it'll survive being out in ambient conditions. So this is a little bit of some photos that I take of my grafting process. So I do them in these 50 cell trays. These are the rootstocks, which is not how you should do it. I would recommend 2-inch pots for the rootstocks. And then you can see a tray of scions over here. So there's 200 scions in this 200 cell flat, 50 rootstocks in each of these trays. And one of the most difficult parts of grafting is getting the rootstocks and the scions to be the same size at the time that you want to graft them. which if you want to learn more about principles of tomato grafting or the vegetable grafting manual. And so this is a picture just after grafting. So I went through, I put on the clips, I slipped on the scion, and then this is healing. So we talk about we want it to be a warm, humid, dark environment. And it turns out that my office at work is perfect. So we have these humidity domes to keep the humidity at about 90 to 100% relative humidity. It's 70 degrees in my office always, and I can turn off the lights. And so, I leave them in the office for a week. We go through the healing process, and then I can, bring them back to the greenhouse and look at them. They're all happy, and all these are planted now, and they're doing well. And this is some of the effects. So here we have the BHN 871, yellow tomato variety, grafted and ungrafted. These photos were taken on the same day from the same harvest. So 5 plants, and you can see, we have our unblemished tomatoes, we have our light blossom and speckling or blossom and sparkles, and then our heavy necrotic blossom and rot. And you can see that, the marketable yields are much higher for the grafted than the ungrafted. This is the data from last year. We did early girl on Dro, early girl on Portamino, and you can see, twice the unblemished yield for early girl grafted. But then there's the flavor question. Do the grafted tomatoes taste as good? So this is a scale of 1 to 5. People did tomato taste tests, and they're ranking the flavor intensity. And 3.6 seems kind of low, but and then we have 3.3, so not that big of a difference between them. Um, and this is just one taste test from one trial. Hopefully, we'll get to do more work on grafting and taste tests and see how this differs depending on site. So the next tool after grafting that I think that's super important for farmers to understand is weed management. Um, this is the most important goal of floor management for dry farming. And a lot of farmers use something called a dust mulch to maintain a weed-free floor. So by dust mulching, you're basically going through and cultivating after a rain event. This breaks up any soil crusting, it terminates the weeds, and it aerates the soil. And by aerating the soil, it dries it out and prevents new weeds from sprouting. Um, so this here is a rolling cultivator that's going through a dry farm tomato field in California. This video was taken by Barisa Ranch, which is, near Santa Cruz. And you can see, yeah, the rolling cultivator is loosening up the soil. It's terminating any weeds, and it's helping to aerate it and keep it loose. And that prevents new weeds from germinating. You can use a lot of different tools for creating that dust mulch. So here, Lucas Niebert at the Vegetable Research Farm is running a rototiller and just terminating, I mean, not terminating, but breaking up that crust and making a, cultivated dust mulch. So here we have a soil crust. And if we left this soil crust to dry out, it would grow really rock hard, and it would be impossible to weed later in the growing season. But by, loosening up the soil, then you can get in later if there are still weeds, and you can easily remove them. And then another tool you can use is the wheel hoe. So here's Lucas running a wheel hoe and just breaking up getting rid of any weeds. You could use this to break up that soil crust. This soil here looks pretty loose already, but you can see how easily he's able to just push this thing through between the rows and get rid of all those weeds that are there. So people do all sorts of crazy tractor setups. I love this one. We've got the rolling cultivator with the gang of spiders. We got finger weeders. We got sweeps. So there's all sorts of things you can throw on your tractor to make that dust mulch. And a really great book for learning more about these tools would be like Steel in the Field, which is available for free on Western States website. But yeah, you can use things that don't even move in the soil. Like this is a sweep, I believe, that can, basically just go put it under that surface crust, break it up as you drive along. And then one thing that people often ask about are mulches, like, oh, I want to do no-till, I want to use a leaf mulch or something like that. And one of the crazy things about leaf mulches, at least, is that they actually reduce marketable yields and increase blossom end rot. And the reason for this is because the leaf mulch acts as this sponge full of nutrients that the plants they take up these nutrients, they get really, really big, they set lots of fruit, and then they get really stressed out later in the season. And it actually, yeah, all those fruit develop blossom end rot, and they're really small. I know that some growers in Washington use landscape fabric. This also helps to control the weeds. And they say that the landscape fabric, it keeps the ground warmer and it helps to increase the growth rate of the plants. I don't know how it affects their yields or fruit quality. But these are some alternatives. And maybe something like a straw mulch or a wood chip mulch would be more appropriate for dry farming, but definitely, dry farm tomato, do not use a leaf mulch because, yeah, your plants will get really big and they'll have lots of blossom and rot. So the next tool is site selection. The first thing about site selection is that you want to have a good soil for dry farming. And I've recommended all these tools to people. We've been testing a lot of tools, but it seems like site factors are one of the most important things for dry farming success. And the things that I implement, like different fertilizer amendments or plant spacing, they have kind of a marginal effect. Grafting and weeding, these things have a big effect. So they do a good job of controlling blossom and rot. Some of the things after this I'm going to talk about, the effect is pretty small when you compare it to something like the effect of soil. And with soils, you want to have a pH between 5.5 and 6.5 for tomato. If the soil is too acidic, then this basically allows these aluminum ions to be released into the soil that are naturally part of like clay minerals. And the aluminum is toxic for plants. Um, and so you want to have a good soil pH so that the roots get nice and deep. Yeah, I should get into soil a little more like basically the two things that soil is going to provide you is water. So soil textures, hold moisture for the crop. The best soils are silt loams and silty clay loams. And then the depth is really important. The deeper the roots can get, whether because that's a good soil pH or because there's no compaction or subsoil constraints, the better. And one of the farms that I worked on last year, we had a trial on, it had a soil called an obrig silt loam. And silt loam sounds good. That has a really high water holding capacity. But that the obrigs, they have this thing called an abrupt textural contrast. So, as you go from the topsoil into the subsoil, it gets really, really firm, really, really clayey. And we collected roots from these depths and found that there were very few roots growing in the subsoil. And so I think that's why it had 70% blossom end rot at that site. It's just like the amount of water available to the crop was restricted. And so soil is super important. Having sufficient nutrients is also important. This is one of our fertilizer trials we had in 2023. You can see on the left here, these tomatoes received no fertilizer. On the right, these ones received 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And this is actually the exception. This site here was former pasture that had just been put into crops. The pH was like 4.5. The total phosphorus availability was 1 part per million. So this is definitely an outlier site. And on most farms, we don't see a big increase in yield or in plant size when we add fertilizers. So we talked about soil, we talked about soil pH, nutrients. These are kind of the different, there's soil physical properties, soil chemistry, but then the climate is really important too. And for climate, they recommend minimum of 50 degrees at night, maximum of 87. Obviously, you can't control this. This photo I showed you earlier of the sun scalding, this photo was taken on the 8th of July after a 4-day heat wave where temperatures were, around 100 degrees. And so it's that high temperature combined with the low foliar coverage. So this variety in particular, there aren't a lot of leaves protecting these fruit. You end up with lots of sun scalding. And, dry farm tomatoes, generally the plants are smaller and they have less foliage. And so, that's why sun scalding is a bigger issue for dry farm tomatoes and why air temperature is super important. Another thing that's really important is vapor pressure deficit. And this is really important for blossom end rot because the hotter and drier the air is, the more blossom end rot you get. So vapor pressure deficit basically is the dryness of the air. It's like the inverse of humidity. So rather than measuring how wet the air is with humidity, you're measuring how dry the air is with vapor pressure deficit. And this map shows the mean maximum vapor pressure deficit in August. And so you can see here in the Willamette Valley, it's more humid than maybe Southern Oregon where it's hotter and drier. And it's those hotter and drier places where you get more blossom end rot. Another thing is that this is an average, and in some years it can be really hot and dry. So we find in years where the vapor pressure deficit is higher, where it's hotter and drier, you get lower yields and you get more blossom and rot. And then another site selection thing that isn't really related to blemishes is the growing degree days. But this is important for having a profitable farm because, if you're on the coast where it's nice and cool and humid, you might be like, you're watching this presentation right now, you're living on the coast. You look at how dark it is, you're like, oh, wow, I've got a really humid site. This would be really great for dry farming. But you also want to make sure that you get enough heat to mature your crop in time. So like I was saying in the Willamette Valley, we're getting our first tomatoes at the end of July. On the coast, it's much later because it's cooler. And so even though, the plants aren't going to be as stressed because the vapor pressure deficit is lower, you're going to have fewer growing degree days. That heat accumulation that is required to mature your crop in a timely manner is going to be lower. So these are all important things in site selection. We're actually just about to publish a site suitability guide for dry farming through OSU Extension. That is in press right now. Still waiting to get the final copy. But I'm really excited to put that out hopefully in the next month or two. And you can, go through these and get a lot more information about, not only how these different factors affect dry farming, but how to measure them on your farm. And then wind speed is really important too. So wind speeds drive evapotranspiration. The more wind you get, the more drought stress the crop will be. And we'll talk a little bit later about how, we've tried to use shelters to block the wind to see if that will help with blossom and rot. One thing I share with growers sometimes is this book here. It's from like the 80s. It's called Agricultural Productivity Ratings for Soils of the Willamette Valley. It's by this person, Huddleston, who was an extension specialist. But I really like this book because, if you know how to use Web Soil Survey, if you can go and look at what soils you have on your farm, you can see the max productivity rating for dry farming. And so here we have some soil types. So Philomath is the soil series, and then stony silty clay. And you can see it has a max productivity rating of 14. And the highest you can get on this productivity rating list is an 80 for dry land. So you can see this down here, the Quatam loam is up at 79. And these numbers we've found are correlated with yields for dry farm crops. The other good thing to look at would be the soil water holding capacity. This can range anywhere from, 3 or lower all the way up to 12 inches of water holding capacity. So that higher that number is, the higher your yields are going to be. These things are very strongly correlated with each other. So we've talked about some tools now. We have grafting, weeding, site selection. The next tool to talk about is fertilizer management. We've already looked at this picture of our fertilizer trial. One thing that we've found with dry farming is that the more fertilizer you put down in the spring, you get an increase in blossom end rot, you get a decrease in yellow shoulders, you get smaller fruit, and they're more intensely flavored. So you get higher soluble salts concentration. So we can see here on this plot, this is the low fertility one. This is the high fertility one. This one will have more blossom end rot, but will have less yellow shoulders. We'll have, sweeter fruit. And this was true across a bunch of different sites. But it kind of shows a conundrum for growers because the same treatments that help you control blossom end rot, like not putting down a bunch of fertilizer or using grafted plants, can also affect flavor intensity. And then across the majority of farms, the average farm, there's no effect on yield of using these fertilizers, up to a point. I imagine if we were to put down a whole bunch, then we'd get so much blossom end rot that maybe we'd start to lose our marketable yield. So this figure, I mean, this picture here is from the same year as this data, and this is showing how soil nitrate concentrations affect different variables. So on the top here, we have average fruit weight. On the bottom, we have soil nitrate concentration. So every time we have one of these plots, I collect a soil sample. There's 3 per farm because there's 3 different treatments. And we're measuring that soil nitrate concentration. And you can see that on these low nitrate soils, we have really big fruit. And the high nitrate soils, we have small fruit. You can see that as the soil nitrate concentration goes up, we're getting more blossom and rot on average. As the soil nitrate concentration goes up, we're getting less yellow shoulders on average. And then finally, as the soil nitrate concentration increases, we're getting more sugars. So this SSC is soluble solids concentration. It's the percent sugar of the juice. So down here, this site, which has really low blossom end rot, also has really low sugars. And these other sites where you have really high soil nitrate concentrations, you're getting lots and lots of sugar, but you're also getting more blossom end rot. And that's the conundrum for growers is, you want to balance your yield with your fruit quality. All right, so we have a few more to go through. This will be pretty quick though. So the next tool is plant spacing. We've found through our research that planting at 2,000 plants per acre is optimal. As you go from 1,000 plants to 2,000 plants, you actually get less blossom end rot. So planting at 2,000 plants per acre, you're having lower blossom end rot. But you're also having increases in yield. So 2,000 plants per acre is the way to go. We've also tested 2,000 to 4,000. And as we went from 2,000 to 4,000, we started to get an increase in blossom and rot and no change in yield. And so that's why, we recommend 7 to 10 feet between rows, 18 to 24 inches in row spacing, 2,000 plants per acre, and that's sort of like the optimum for dry farmers. There it is. Trellising is also can be used. A lot of farmers trellis their tomatoes. I tend not to because it's a lot of work. And we did a trial in 23 where we looked at trellising and we found that trellising, it increased the marketable yields and it increased average fruit weight. So the fruit were bigger, there were higher yields, there was less sun scalding. And this was because, the plants, they were better covering the fruit with the vines and the leaves. So you had better coverage and then you got less direct sunlight on the fruit. And the reason we tested trellising is I actually thought it was going to increase blossom end rot. And the reason for this is because when you lift the plant up, when you elevate it, there's more wind through the canopy. This would stress the plants out. But actually, we didn't see an effect on blossom end rot. So, if you want to trellis, and a lot of the growers in California do trellis, I think they might be trellising for ease of harvest or for other reasons. But it also can help prevent sun scalding and it can increase your marketable yields. And I was trying to figure out why this might be. And one thing I noticed with my sprawling tomatoes is that these tomatoes, the plants, they start to get really big. They get really heavy, the vines, because they're loaded with fruit. And then the vines crack. And, this allows sunlight into the canopy. This is what causes the fruit to get sun scald. And this could potentially also reduce yields because it's damaging the plant. Um, so we talked about the different treatments that do affect blemishes. Now we're going to talk about some that don't affect blemishes. And we talked a little bit earlier about how I was really interested in controlling wind, and that wind speed was going to be, something that could affect tomato blossom end rot. So we planted these shelter trials. So you can see me here with my broom corn on the right, and then this one, this is sorghum. Both of these were really great at blocking the wind. Some other ones we tested, corn and sunflowers, were not as great at blocking the wind, but ultimately there was very little effect. There was a small decrease in blossom and rot, but I don't think it was worth the amount of space that these shelters took up. And another thing we tested too was this wind screen. So this is something you can buy, off of like the orchard or vineyard management store or something. But this windscreen, it blocked, 50% of the wind. It was really great at blocking wind, and it was, we didn't have to wait for it to grow. With these other crops, they weren't really blocking the wind until August when they reached their mature size. With this windscreen, we put it up in June, and it was always blocking about the same amount of wind consistently. Didn't have to wait for it to grow. But there was also very little effect on blossom end rot. And there was actually a lot of sun scalding. So the plants right along the edge here, closest to this windscreen, they got a lot of sun scald. And I think the reason for that is that this screen is black. It absorbs a lot of long wave radiation and radiates it back onto the plants. And so the temperature was elevated next to this to the windscreen. So yeah, I don't recommend trying to block the wind at this point. We're gonna do more work on it, see how wind affects crops across a diversity of different sites, hopefully, and see if maybe there is an effective wind, but it seems like it's really hard to control using these shelters. And then the last thing that we tested that didn't have an effect was the planting stock management. So I tell growers, seed your tomato plants in early April. You don't want them to be too big when you plant them. Sometimes I'll read online people say, oh, you want to, dig this 2 foot trench and you want to plant this giant tomato plant, because you want the roots to be as deep as possible. That's not true. You want a nice, short, stocky plant. You can seed in early April. You could consider sowing successions. I know a lot of people in California do that, but that's because they run into a lot of disease pressure. And so in order to have a consistent crop, they're doing successions. Um, for the tomato, you want to have a short, stocky plant with a large, healthy root system. These plants right here, they're really tall, they're chlorotic, they've got these stress flowers on them. This is not the ideal plant. The ideal plant looks more like this. It's short, it's stocky, it's nice and green. I would plant something like that right now, just because it looks so pretty. And it's only going to get more stressed and more deteriorated. Um, and so the last tool that we tried was to basically pre-drought stress the plants in the nursery before we planted them. So we can see two of our treatments here. This one was irrigated every time it hit 90% of its field capacity weight. So basically, we took the trays, we watered them, we let them sit, and then we weigh them and we see, oh, this is the maximum water that the tray can hold. And then when it hits 90% of that weight, we'll rewater it. And the one on the left was watered at 50%. And you can see the plants are a little smaller, and they look more stressed. There was no effect of this on anything. So, this is another thing that we tested that was potentially going to be in the toolkit. But the planting stock, uh, you know, these treatments, pre-drought stressing the seedlings, it didn't have an effect. If you're interested in learning more about using container weights to determine irrigation needs, there's this really great paper out of the Forest Service by Dumrose and Pinto. So, check that out. But again, it's doesn't have an effect anyway, so it's not going to affect your dry farm tomatoes. All right, so some last wrap up ideas. One thing to talk about is terroir. We've talked a bit about how the more intensely stressed the plants are, the more flavor intensity they have. And so we think that tomatoes have this terroir where the flavor intensity is affected by the site. But the mechanism for this is different than for wine grapes. With wine grapes, the best wine grapes are grown in sites where there's moderate stress on the vines, where there's moderate vine growth, and where there's limited nitrogen availability. Whereas what we found was that the sites where the plants were the most stressed, they have the smallest fruit and they have the most blossom end rot. They also had the highest flavor intensity. And some of these were like, really small, solid size early girl tomatoes that had, 11 bricks of soluble solids, like 11% sugar and just super flavor intense. But those are the same sites that had 70% blossom end rot. So some of the diseases and pests that we run into, just to be aware of, powdery mildew is a big issue, especially in California. But I've seen it in Oregon too. This is from California, and you can see the powdery mildew right there on the vine, and all the leaves die. And this actually affects the flavor of the tomatoes. It makes them less intensely flavored. we've been trying to control it with inoculants like BioInsure that basically these are fungal inoculants that they go in, they're like endophytes, they move into the vine and they induce resistance. And so then it's harder for the powdery mildew to colonize the plant. I don't know if this works though. We haven't tested it like formally in a trial, but it's something that I've just been spraying on some of the stuff where I know I get powdery mildew. Um, Another issue that we've run into a lot this year is some phylums. So, I talked earlier about how the crops, their roots grow into the native soil in like a day or two, really quickly. But if you have some phylums, which are these root feeding invertebrates, then the roots don't grow, and all the plants, a lot of them will die. This is the only thing I've ever seen kill a dry farm tomato is these symphyllans, and you can test for symphyllans by using these potatoes. You take a potato, you cut it in half, you put it on the moist soil, you leave it for a day, you come out and you look at it, and if you see these little white line, they're little like millipedes running around, then you know you have a problem. So you can see them there in that video. And that's something that we've been really struggling with this year. For some reason, a lot of my farms have the places I'm growing on have some violence right now. And I've had all my tomatoes die at one of the sites from it. So uh, definitely something to be aware of. Dry farm tomato is not a good crop if you know that you have some violent infested soil. So this is the final slide, and it's talking a bit about climate change and dry farming. And a lot of people think, oh, dry farming, it's this like climate adaptive thing. But actually, what we're looking at here is that the Willamette Valley is going to get hotter and drier. So this is the Willamette Valley on average. This is 2018, a hot and dry year, lower yields, more blossom end rot. And this is the future. We're going to see, a hotter and drier Willamette Valley, and potentially this will make dry farming more difficult in the future. At the same time, we have, less reliable water for irrigation. And so these issues are kind of compounding. And this isn't just an issue here in California, it's a big issue too. This farmer, this is from that paper again about the farmer perspectives. And this farmer is basically describing how they're simulating the rainfall that they used to get in the spring to water the plants in. Now they are, using irrigation to simulate that rain. And that might be part of why farmers in California are more interested in using irrigation now for their dry farm crop, is because, these rains they used to rely on to water their crop in um, are not as reliable. And here in the Willamette Valley, you do not need it to rain to successfully grow a dry farm crop like after you plant. So as long as you get enough water in the soil's moist when you plant. If it doesn't rain, that's fine. You'll still get a crop. The plants will grow. In California, it's a different climate. I don't know what's going on there, but they're using this irrigation to simulate these historic rainfalls. And so that's another example of how climate change is affecting dry farming throughout the West Coast. All right, so I've gone about 10 minutes over what I said I was going to do. And I'm sure you all have lots of questions, but really quick, thank you to my students this year, Charlie and George, the Dry Farming Collaborative, all my farmer partners, my collaborators, other researchers and inspirations, the people who've contributed, especially Western SARE, which funded the Blossom and Rot Toolkit Project, and then Oregon State Horticulture and the Center for Resilient Ag and Food Systems. So now we can go on to questions.
Wow, thanks so much, Matt. That was great. I'm going to turn back my video on. Yes, you really have accumulated a huge amount of data, and it was really interesting to hear about all the difficulties of doing dry farming and how it's such a balancing act. We have some questions coming in. I'm just going to read the first one that I see while I get both windows up. How much does grafting increase the labor costs for dry farming tomatoes?
Yeah, grafted plants are obviously more expensive to produce than ungrafted plants. I'm not sure about the economics. I know that other people have done research on the economics of grafting and how much more expensive the plants are, and their general takeaway is that it is economical to do grafting. Um, I can look into that. And it's not the only thing that's more expensive. So not only are you taking the time and the labor to graft the plants and to heal them, but you're also buying twice as much seed because you have to buy a rootstock seed and a scion seed, and rootstock isn't necessarily cheap. And then you end up wasting a lot. I talked about how it's really difficult for you to match the scion with the rootstock perfectly. And so, one thing that you might end up doing is over sowing the scion or sowing succession. So like you could sow some of the scion 2 days before the rootstock, some on the day that you sow the rootstock, and some 2 days after. And maybe you end up using like 50% or 70% of that scion. So they recommend that you sow a lot more than you actually end up using. And I know some growers will, save that scion leftover, like the leftover stuff that they didn't use for grafting, and they'll up pot that and they'll sell it or they'll plant it as ungrafted plants. But yeah, definitely grafting is ex more expensive. I don't know exactly how much more expensive. And it's interesting, there's a lot of automation now too in grafting. You can buy grafted plants from, wholesale nurseries, and you get a sense of how much more expensive they are compared to ungrafted. But um, anyway, yeah, I
Yeah.
wish I had actual numbers, but it's definitely something you could look up. People have done research on it. So.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. We did have a couple of webinars on grafting tomatoes, by the way, which are on our webinar archive page if you just search for webinars by eOrganic. I just want to ask this important question before we get to some of the others. Where can people find the dry farming toolkit that you've created?
Yeah, I'm still working on getting like a final publication together for the toolkit. There's lots of resources at the OSU Dry Farming Program's website, which I can put a link in the chat, and that includes like all of my papers, all of our papers, I should say, and extension pubs, including an extension pub on dry farm tomatoes. So yeah, we have lots of resources. I would like to create one for the uh, for the toolkit. I have a website for the toolkit, which is linked at the dry farming program page, but it's not complete yet. I need to do some more work on it.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely put a link to that on the eOrganic page with the webinar recording as well, just so that people can find it there too. Okay, so do you recommend dry farming for home gardeners if they're in a favorable location?
Yeah, this is something that I know gardeners are interested in trying out, and Amy Garrett, who started the dry farming program and has since moved on to the Dry Farming Institute, she's given talks on how to do dry gardening. Um, and I've been working with the Multnomah County Master Gardeners for years now, and they do a dry farming plot in Portland at their demonstration garden. Um, it depends on what your goals are. If your goals are to cut down on your municipal water use, um, and to try to grow, interesting uh, products that, like a dry farm tomato, that's pretty unique, then I would definitely recommend, giving it a shot. And, you could use some of the same principles that you learned about here about, controlling weeds, about, like making sure your soil is the right pH. That's the two things I see that small growers, uh, usually mess up on is the soil pH and the weeds. But I think there's a lot of cross applicable ideas, and but yeah, know that you'll have lower yields, and making sure that you have a good soil for it. The Multnomah County Master Gardener site, a lot of the Portland soils are pretty gravelly, and so it's not as good for dry farming. Um,
Okay, so here's the question. What is the effect of a day of rain on dry farm tomatoes? I know there'll probably be people listening who might be interested in trying dry farming in areas where it does rain in the summertime.
yeah, yeah. So rain affects dry farm crops in a number of ways. If you get enough rain, then you might have a slight increase in yields. The thing that drives dry farm yields is water availability, and you get water in two different ways if you're dry farming. One is the water that's stored in the soil. That's going to depend on factors like your soil texture, the soil depth. that how much water it can hold. And then the other thing that's going to add water to your system is rain. And so, if you get a bunch of rain, it's hopefully going to increase your yields. And we've come up with these like conceptual models for how much an inch of water increases your yield. And what we came up with was that every inch of available water increased your yield by like 2 tons per acre. Um, so, the highest performing sites where we have 12 inches of available water holding capacity, they tend to have about 20 to 30 tons per acre of yield. So, we think that rain will increase your yields. Unfortunately, rain does something else. It germinates weeds. And so a lot of dry farmers, especially the old school ones, they really don't like rain. I've been working as the first day I started this job doing the dry farm research in 2019. We went out to visit this old school dry farmer in Veneta, Oregon named Dick Wadsworth, who's, been dry farming. He started in California, dry farming since like the 70s, and so he's been doing this a long time. And there's actually an article that he has that was an interview that was like myths about dry farming, and he talked a bit about that. I think that rain is not necessarily good and that it can germinate weeds and things like that. So, and what he does is if he has a really big rainstorm, he'll go out and he'll cultivate. He'll do that dust mulch, try to loosen that up. And so whether that's with a rototiller or uh, sweeps or something like that.
Okay, so we have a question of what cover crops you use.
Yeah, we've used a mix of cover crops. We have used no cover crops. And we don't have any formal cover crop trials on what cover crops are good for dry farming. This is actually something I'm hoping to start next year. We put in another Western SARE proposal to do research on cover cropping, on different cover crop species and mixes, how they affect dry farm crops, and you know, what the best termination time is too. Um, I think that we've had really great success with a mixture of grasses and legumes. Um, So that's what I would recommend. If you want to do a cover crop, you a fall seeded cover crop, doing a mixture of grasses and legumes.
Okay, let's see. Is there a correlation between soil organic matter and the water holding capacity?
Yeah, I definitely think that there is. I also think that organic matter might be a little overrated. Um, I was talking to a farmer out of Washington, and she was interested in doing dry farming on a small scale on one of these muck soils. And I'd never heard of a muck soil before. They're really high organic matter kind of bogs, basically, not very well drained. And so I looked it up, and it had 24 inches of available water holding capacity, which was mind blowing because I had never seen anything above 13. And so that's really high. There's other issues with these muck soils, like they're really acidic and the water is an issue. Because they don't drain very well. Uh, but yeah, I think that between like 3 to 8% organic matter is really great. With dry farm tomatoes, as you start to get more and more organic matter, it's correlated with other things like soil nutrients. And so the soils with the highest soil organic matter tend to also have really high blossom end rot because there's just like so much nutrient availability from the organic matter that it causes the plants to get really big and they set lots of fruit and all the fruit will blossom and rot. And so yeah. But yeah, I think like 3 to 5% is great. The other thing is because you're a dry farmer, the subsoil is actually just as important as the topsoil. And organic matter is mostly going to be concentrated in the topsoil and maybe in the first 9 inches of soil. So I think that that's another thing to think about is that, you know, the depths that these roots are getting, there's not a lot of organic matter. Um, but yeah, it's something I'd be interested in doing more work on.
Okay.
Uh,
Let's see. You mentioned early girl before as one of the popular dry farming varieties. Are there other varieties that work especially well for dry farming? Somebody's also wondering about sources for
y-
seed varieties.
Yeah, there are lots of great varieties, including varieties that have historically been dry farmed. There's a lot of Italian varieties that you can get from Uprising Seeds or Heirloom Seed House in Portland. Uprising Seeds is in Bellingham, I think. Um, they grow these Italian varieties. We had at our winter convening this year a Sicilian dry farmer, traditional dry farmer. He runs a farm and is part of a co-op in Sicily, and they really recommend Pizzutello, which is like it's a paste tomato, and then the Principice de Borghese, um, which is another paste tomato. Pignolo del Vesuvio is one of these hanging tomato varieties. We talk about it quite a bit in the dry farm tomato extension pub. All these are historically dry farmed, but they're all like paste tomatoes. And I don't think there's as much of a market for those here for like a dry farm paste tomato. Maybe. I mean, as far as other varieties, I still haven't found a variety that I am as eager to grow as Early Girl. There's lots of varieties that are comparable. And but like flavor is super important, blossom end rot resistance is super important, yield is super important. Some of the ones that I really like that aren't Early Girl but have a lot of other issues. I really like this one called Cosmonaut Volkov, which you might not be able to get the seeds anymore. It was from High Mowing. And I thought that one had just really great flavor, but it was also really susceptible to yellow shoulder, really susceptible to cracking. We have lots of data on varieties at our dry farming tomato website. And I know that Adaptive Seeds is out of Sweet Home, Oregon, and they have a whole like list of open pollinated varieties that we've trialed of theirs that they recommend for dry farming based on our data.
Okay, can you talk about calcium
Yeah,
availability and blossom end rot? That I knew that question was going to come up, so
yeah,
thanks
me
for that.
too. I love it. Yeah, calcium. So basically, there are two different theories as to what causes blossom end rot. And the one that everyone knows is that it's caused by calcium deficiency in the fruit. But that it's never actually calcium. It's that there's not enough water in the soil, and so the plant can't take up the calcium, or there's too many other nutrients like potassium and ammonium or whatever, and these, are preferentially taken up by the plant, and so you end up with calcium deficiency in the fruit. There's another theory, and it's a theory that I tend to agree with more, is that blossom end rot is caused by stress, especially oxidative stress, so that as the plant gets drought stressed, basically plants use oxygen similar to how we use oxygen. It's called the final electron receptor or receiver or something in the electron transport chain. It's part of cellular respiration. And what happens is that, we take carbohydrates and oxygen, and we turn them into carbon dioxide and water. That's like the basis of cellular respiration. But sometimes those oxygen species can turn into what are called reactive oxygen species. And these would be things like peroxide. These are highly toxic chemicals that plants produce when they, are doing regular plant things. And the way that plants control these is through something called antioxidants. So they have these antioxidants, and these antioxidants quench and they break down these reactive oxygen species so that they don't destroy the plant cells. And so the theory is that when the plants get really drought stressed, this system that they have for controlling reactive oxygen species starts to fall apart. And so you get accumulations of these reactive oxygen species in the fruit, and that's what causes it to get blossom and rot. I don't know which of these theories is more correct. I will say that we have a lot of evidence that calcium does not affect blossom and rot in dry farm tomatoes. In 2019, we did a study on site suitability for dry farming. We found that the sites that had more soil available calcium had more blossom and rot. And the reason for this, I think, is because the sites where there was more calcium availability, there was also lots of other nutrients. These were these high fertility sites where you get lots of blossom and rot. We also know that the deeper you get into the soil, when you get into the subsoil, there's not a lot of potassium, there's not a lot of ammonium, there's not a lot of phosphorus, but there's a lot of calcium. So calcium is one of the few nutrients that actually increases with depth. So if a dry farm crop is utilizing the subsoil and where there's abundant calcium, it's kind of weird that they get more blossom end rot than irrigated tomatoes. So then in 2020, we did a soil management trial where we tested gypsum as one of our calcium inputs, and gypsum had no effect on blossom end rot. Part of the issue might have been that the gypsum, we applied it in the spring. So maybe the calcium didn't work into the soil enough. And there really wasn't much of an effect of gypsum on soil calcium concentrations. Calcium is like the most abundant nutrient available in soils. Like typically see 2,000 parts per million calcium. So there's lots of calcium in the soil already, and that might be why doing these calcium amendments doesn't have much of an effect. And then the other thing was that the treatment that had the most blossom and rot, which was the weedy treatment, we collected these leaf samples, at the end of July, I think. So like the middle of the growing season. The leaves of the weedy treatment, where there was the most blossom end rot, they also had the highest calcium concentration. And I think it's because the weeds were competing with other crops, with the weeds were competing with the tomato for that, the other nutrients like potassium and whatever. Um, and then there's more stuff too. So I've always been really skeptical of the calcium thing, but I read papers all the time that, show like the mechanism and everything, and I'm not smart enough to like figure it out. So I don't know. I think that there might be something to the calcium story, but for me and what I focused on has been controlling stress. And I think that that's even a better way for farmers to think about it because calcium, you go to the store and you see containers of calcium nitrate that say, will stop blossom end rot. And if the actual issue is that you're not watering enough, I don't think it matters how much calcium nitrate you put down. And even the calcium people, even the people who say calcium is the reason that you get blossom and rot, that there's not enough calcium, they always say, but it's not actually the calcium. It's that there's not enough water to take up the calcium. So it's not even like, is it even worth thinking about? I'm probably wrong. You're going to all have crop failures and you're going to come back to me and be like, it was the calcium. Yeah,
Okay. Let's see. Do you know a link or on the second theory?
yeah.
This one? Yeah.
So the way that I got into this way of thinking uh, was I read these papers by this guy named Max Sauer, who's a German um, scientist, I think. Uh, I just put one in there because when I started this job in 2019, I was like, I don't think it's calcium, and I started reading, and that's what got me in trouble, I guess. So that's one of the papers. He wrote two papers about it. Um, so I just linked that Max Sauer paper, which is called "Why Calcium Deficiency is Not the Cause of Blossom and Rot." So yeah, definitely, it's hard to understand. I have a hard time reading that paper, but it talks about, this other theory of the reactive oxygen species.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I think we have time for one final question,
Yeah.
and that is, do you think small and medium-sized tomatoes are best? Because Carlos here has much worse experience with big tomatoes cracking and cat facing.
Yeah, absolutely. I tell people often when they want to start dry farming that if you want to do tomatoes, doing a cherry tomato or a saladette tomato, those smaller tomatoes, they're just generally more resistant to blemishes, especially blossom and rot. But also, like you say, cracking and cap facing, like big beefsteak tomatoes. Um, they get lots of cracking, they get lots of yellow shoulder, they get lots of cap facing. And, I was growing one that I really like called Damsel, and it's a beefsteak, type big tomato. And it looked awful when I was growing it dry. It had lots of cracking along the top and yellow shoulder and cap facing. And then I had one that I planted in my garden that was irrigated, and I pulled the tomato out, and it was just so beautiful and like that perfect pink color and no blemishes. And I made me second guess some of my life choices. But yeah, the smaller fruited tomatoes definitely less blossom end rot, and that's something I've noticed with the paste tomatoes in Italy that they're growing dry farmed, like I talked about Pizzatello and Principe Borghese, and these are all smaller tomatoes. They're not they're not big like Amish paste tomatoes. And I've noticed that with those bigger paste tomatoes like Amish paste or Cordoba, they definitely get more blossom and rot and have more issues.
Yeah.
So smaller tomatoes definitely, especially if you're just starting out, they're going to be the most resistant. Yeah.
Okay, that was great, Matt. Thank you
Right.
so much for this really informative and very interesting presentation. It sounds like you still have your hands full. There's tons more to learn. And we'll definitely look forward to hearing more as you learn more in your future project. So thanks again, Matt, and thanks to everyone else for joining us.
Thank you.